Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Hank, The Short Life and Long Country Road of Hank Williams, by Mark Ribowsky, read by Tom Perkins. Introduction. Just Plain Hank. Of the 33 records that Hank Williams placed on Billboard country and western top 10 charts during his short lifetime, only 2 made the mainstream pop chart, and even those had much to do with pop artists like Tony Bennett having their own hits with them first. Yet, more than 60 years after his premature death at age 29, no country artist, living or dead, can approach the familiarity the general public has with Hank Williams, whose sad, lonely songs are playing right this minute on some roadhouse jukebox. Few musical legends live on as an almost touchable, feelable presence in the anatomy of modern popular music as does the enigmatic, goofy-looking guy who carried a nascent country music formula to its full potential, then exited stage right in total and abject loneliness. Consider textural lyrics about robins weeping and leaves dying, the will to live lost, punctuated by the lament, "I'm so lonesome I could cry." Those are among the saddest words ever written and sung in music. Elvis once said so, and arguably the greatest. But the truth is, writing about music is never as effective as the act of simply listening to it. And when Hank Williams is listened to, something revelatory seems to happen. To make the point, a good prelude to listening to this audiobook would be to find and listen to his first successful song, the 1947 12-bar blues rag Move It On Over, which spins a melody instantly recognizable as Bill Haley and his Comets' We're Gonna Rock Around the Clock, which birthed rock and roll to the masses a year after Hank Williams died. Haley had also ripped off Cold, Cold Heart, retitling his record Icy Heart. Hank's honky-tonk classic I'm a Long-Gone Daddy is the derivation of Bruce Springsteen's line about being a long-gone daddy in the USA. His guttural blues lament, Ramblin' Man, I love you, baby, but you gotta understand, when the Lord made me, he made a ramblin' man, foretold Dickie Betts's tune that swaggers along in the grand tradition of Hank Williams. Hank even sang about purple skies long before Prince was born. Keith Richards says Honky-Tonk Women was written as a Hank Jimmy Rogers sort of number. The first popular reference to a Rolling Stone was heard in Hank's 1949 cover of Leon Payne's Lost Highway. And obscure as it is, on an early demo record, covering Lonnie Glossom's Rockin' Chair Money, he sang, "And now I'll rock, yeah, rock, oh baby, rock, rock on down the line." That was in 1948. Among the country set, there have always been similar assumptions about the broad lines of his work. For example, Wesley Rose, the son of Hank's publisher and producer Fred Rose, the hidden hand behind the magic of those songs, once said that had Hank lived, I don't think we could have had a rock era. His point being that rock and roll was a cheap replacement for Hank's music rather than a logical extension of roots that included it. But then, the same people used to say Elvis wasn't welcome in Nashville unless he stopped with that wriggling-jiggling rock and roll stuff. Even so, it was hard to deify him during his lifetime, so proudly unrefined was he. His songs, culled at times from the pages of comic books, celebrated simple human concepts: God, beer, a good woman, and a blessed break from loneliness. Yet to some even then he was the voice of not only a more liberal South, but also the common people, another way of saying white trash. That quality still resonates in his music, explaining why in a cultural maw he never could have foreseen, there have been 2 Pepsi Super Bowl commercials built around Your Cheatin' Heart, and that his music bleeds far beyond its strictest borders, the reason why Williams owns a posthumous Pulitzer Prize for lifetime achievement. The only other posthumous Pulitzers for music have been awarded to Thelonious Monk, John Coltrane, Duke Ellington, George Gershwin, and Scott Joplin. Yet none of the others ever sold a record as far and wide as Your Cheatin' Heart, which has been played over 3 million times on the radio and jukeboxes, or 17.1 years if continuously played, the same level as My Way and Love Me Tender. As with Patsy Cline, Jim Reeves, Cowboy Copas, and the legendary rock and roll victims of lousy planes or their own vices, Williams's premature death in the back seat of his baby blue Cadillac on New Year's Day, 1953, romances his flaws and elevates his mythology, the loneliness of it lending believability to his litany of sad, sad songs. Dying as he did, he set the trend for the later rock and roll shooting stars who never made 30, a sort of post-teenagel with never-resolved issues but a beyond-cool epitaph. As the country singer Jason Aldean, whose 2010 album My Kind of Party was a massive crossover success, warbles on its title track, "You can find me in the back of a jacked-up tailgate, chillin' with some Skinnerd and some old Hank." He has been sung and written about like this as Old Hank without pause, a wraith for Southern men old enough to remember him stamping their own youth. One of those was the Alabama-born journalist Paul Hemphill, who wrote the superb 1970 book The Nashville Sound, Bright Lights and Country Music. He authored a book late in his life called Lovesick Blues, The Life of Hank Williams, prefiguring his own times on the lonely byways of the South, a bond created when, as a teenager, he sat in his daddy's truck in 1949, hearing Williams's nasal wail which sounded like a herd animal. They were the loneliest sounds we had ever heard, cries from the darkness, made to be heard, it seemed to us, while running through the lonely night, racing with the moon, the wind whistling through the cab, gliding past Sea Rock City barns and Burma Shave signs and spooky pastures milling with dumbstruck cows. With the whining of the tires keeping time, we laughed at each other's attempts to emulate Hank's yodel. That is really the thematic outline of Williams's near-subconscious grip on culture. His music, centrally what Loretta Lynn calls the throb in it, and his persona are markers of a time long gone, and so stripped of modern glamour and convenience that his own failings, like his successes, cut right to the bone. At times, we wish we could crawl inside those songs and ride them like an old truck through time. And that is essentially what this book does. Race with the moon through history, and tell not just the story, but the backstory of uniquely American circumstances and influences bred by other pioneers of country. Williams's tortured soul and his drug and booze addictions were the result of weakness and recklessness, but on a grander scale wrote the script for the live fast, die young, leave a pretty corpse ethos of the modern rock and roll movement. Not that some haven't drawn a line at such a seduction. In Hank Williams Syndrome, a broken-down Waylon Jennings, one of the primal country outlaws, sings of Hank as his inspiration, less a singing model than an obsession. But to tell you the truth, it's no thanks to you that I'm still living today. In truth, to be sure, Hank himself was a poor excuse for a rebel. What separated him from moral reproof was that he carried on his ruinous lifestyle in pain, not pride. Cautionary tales lurked beneath the grooves of his music. True enough, as Hank himself pointed out, was that his songs explained who he was. The best ones are a catalogue of unrelenting agony and the hopelessness he sold. I'm so lonesome I could cry, Cold, Cold Heart, I'll Never Get Out of This World Alive, Lost Highway, Your Cheatin' Heart, Take These Chains from My Heart, Alone and Forsaken, I'm Blue Inside, Moanin' the Blues. Often forgotten is that Lovesick Blues and Lost Highway were not written by Williams. But he also wrote of finding a way through the dark clouds and landing, if even for a few minutes, in a glen of relieved burdens, like the toe-tapping reverie of Jambalaya, Hey Good-Lookin', I Saw the Light, Baby We're Really in Love, I Can't Help It If I'm Still in Love with You. It's telling that because these songs hit home so squarely, no one knew him as Mr. Williams. He was just plain Hank. Sometimes Williams recorded under the pseudonym Luke the Drifter, an alter ego with which to preach morality tales and semi-rapped talking blues records like Ramblin' Man. But by any other name he was just plain Hank. For a guy who was such a good time, though, Hank was, let's face it, seriously disturbed. He was a dysfunction junction. When sober, he could be kind and humble. When drunk, a mean, moody, raving egomaniac. He humiliated his two-time wife and hinge-voiced singing partner, the tempestuous temptress Miss Audrey Williams, and shot either at her or over her head while in a haze once, and according to lore, later remarked that because he missed, "Well, I'll just have to go back and kill her." He didn't, but their marriage was still a battle zone during which she nearly died from a coat-hanger abortion. After his death, she took control of his estate, managed the career of their son, Hank Jr., formed a singing group called the Cold Cold Hearts, was a raging alcoholic and pill popper herself, attempted suicide, was arrested for drunk driving, and lived with the guilt of feeling that she had caused Hank's drinking and early demise. A day before the IRS was to raid her home in 1975, she died young and addicted herself, at 53. Williams was, indeed, the aboriginal ramblin' man, trying to make a livin' doing the best he could, which only happened when he wrote a song. Today his catalog attests to the raw power of a good country song, of a good song, period. The connection between his folk and rock is clear, given that, in what the British music writer Nick Cohn calls the twisted roots of rock and roll, both idioms sprang from the same blues root, which was why it was so absurd that country became synonymous with white power. For his part, Hank made a point to credit bluesman Rufus Teatot Payne for teaching him blues guitar as a kid. Bob Dylan, who became transfixed by him as a prepubescent in Hibbing, Minnesota, says Hank's songs carved the archetype rules of poetic songwriting. This was a key element common to the country rebels spawned by Williams, like Willie Nelson and Johnny Cash, who brought country firmly into the rock family. Remember that there was no such creature called country music for around 2 decades of its existence, and certainly in no way anything like the mass cult it became, to borrow a phrase from Christopher Lehman Haupt. It was, by default, called hillbilly music. Even the more charitable terms applied to Hank, the hillbilly Shakespeare, the hillbilly Hammerstein, Irving Berlin of the Straw Sack, Sinatra of the hillbilly set, Sinatra of the Western Ballad, were hollow. As rock's most sage critic, Greil Marcus, notes, Elvis, too, was pegged as the hillbilly cat. This was probably why Hank himself called his idiom folk music, though it must have occurred to him that he was, as Garrison Keillor once said, the first really sexy hillbilly. By any other name, he created what one music scholar calls a unique vocal vocabulary, even if by accident. He could neither read nor write music. He once said he knew 2 melodies, fast and slow. His voice was technically all wrong. Another musical academic wrote that, measured against any conventional criteria, either of songwriting or of singing, Hank's appeal makes no sense. Except when he was actually singing. Then he transcended his small, mortal self. Nor was he much of a guitar player, playing only one solo in his career, and some songs were inscrutable. Music, Greil Marcus writes, was the South's great shelter and unifier, bringing under its collective roof even society's rejects, tramps, whores, rounders, idiots, criminals. The singers who rose highest could take the community beyond itself because they had the chops and the nerve to transcend it, though often they were doomed, too ambitious, too ornery, or simply different to fit in. For Hank, there would be a price to pay for that, his life. His children and grandchildren would carry that same gene. All of them sing country, most notably Randall Hank Williams, who's been doing business as Hank Williams Jr. since he was in puberty in the 1950s, later finding immense popularity as a beer-bellied, bearded doppelganger of the father he barely knew. Randall earned a fortune and a brace of awards from his rowdy drinking songs, like his best-known rag, his "Are You Ready for Some Football?" that opened Monday Night Football for years. However, he was possessed of the same tendencies to screw up. His fulminations in 2012 about Barack Obama being a Hitler and a Muslim president who hates farming, hates the military, hates the U.S., cost him the football gig and reduced him to an aging warhorse in his late 60s, covered in a 10-gallon hat and goggle glasses. Hank Jr. symbolized an anti-intellectual country genre his daddy never did, one that is happily crumbling these days. Where country once grinned smugly as Merle Haggard crooned, "We don't smoke marijuana in Muskogee," it must have felt swept by a raging tide when, in 2014, 25-year-old Casey Musgraves won the Grammy for Best Country Song with "Follow Your Arrow," a sly metaphor of gay acceptance that urged, "When the straight and narrow gets a little too straight, roll up a joint, and follow that arrow wherever it points, whether it be to kiss lots of boys or kiss lots of girls." This so unnerved some country allies that a Colorado pastor who advocates death for gay people lamented wistfully, "If she had sang that thing in a country bar in the 1920s, somebody would have called for a rope." But even during those bygone days, Hank Williams' pair had more common sense than the country establishment and its lunatic right-wing retainers had, never allowing himself to be the stereotype of a doltish redneck buffoon. His notion of rebelliousness was to unburden what he felt within about himself, not to give ignorance and bigotry a free ride. Although he recorded only 2 studio albums, both going to #1 on the country charts in the early 50s when the long-form disc came into vogue, at last count, 45 posthumous studio, live, and compilation albums have been issued. Of these, 16 have made the country charts, some with layers of strings overdubbed, as on the 1966 MGM "The Legend Lives Anew" Hank Williams with strings, fairly ruining their intent. 30 singles have as well, only 1 fewer than when he was alive. In all, 26 singles of his have made the top 10 of the country chart. The year that he died, 4 straight went to #1. As a result, he is in the country music and the rock and roll halls of fame, the latter as an early influence and an American master. He has won 2 Grammys, an award born 7 years after he died, and his songs have been and continue to be covered by, well, everyone, with tribute albums by Roy Acuff, Ernest Tubb, Don Gibson, George Jones, Charlie Rich, Johnny Cash, Ronnie Hawkins, Del Shannon, Roy Orbison, and of course, Hank Williams, Jr. The Lost Notebooks of Hank Williams, an all-star tribute album that included Bob Dylan, whose Vanity Egyptian label teamed with Columbia to issue it, Sheryl Crow, Merle Haggard, Levon Helm, Vince Gill, and Norah Jones, went to #11 on the country chart, top 50 on the Billboard 200 in 2011. 4 movies have been made about him. There was also one Drama Desk-nominated off-Broadway musical called Hank Williams' Lost Highway in 2002, produced by the Manhattan Ensemble Theater, which still plays around the country. As another redoubtably wise acolyte, Willie Nelson once said he learned from Hank, "If a song is true for you, it will be true for others." That category now numbers in the millions. And if only old Hank knew what he was feeling, what a song meant, where it came from. The clues can be found sprinkled all over the South, the most trenchant ones in Sweet Home, Alabama. That is where this story can only begin and never stray much from, in the sun-baked soil of hopelessness. Prologue. A wheel in the ditch and a wheel on the track. At the Georgiana Gas and Garage Station off Interstate 65, exit 114, somewhere in southern Alabama, May 2015. The Alabama sky isn't, as Hank Williams sang in I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, a sad purple today. It's bright blue, and the burning sun tears through it with no mercy as two men in their 60s stand at a pump squeezing unleaded gas into their tanks. One, a cherubic red-faced fellow with a dinged-up maroon Pontiac, wearing rumpled jeans and a T-shirt reading Genuine Ford Parts, is asked if he's from around here. He nods. Do you know where the old Hank Williams house might be? Is the next question. He lived around here as a boy, didn't he? From what I've been told, the man says in a thick drawl, a cigarette dangling from his mouth, he had to move 'cause the law was after his daddy. They also say his mama ran some whorehouses too, so you get the picture. Didn't she run boarding houses? Well, they couldn't call 'em that. Still can't. But down here, you know, people gotta eat, gotta make a living. You do what you gotta do on Saturday night, then go to church on Sunday morning and make it all right with God. A belly laugh. Having heard the questioner's New York accent, he knew he was enlightening an out-of-state guy about Alabama, and there had to be a little clarification. These are stories, you understand? A big star like Hank Williams was treated like God here because there aren't many stars who ever came from Alabama. God don't put us here to make a lot of money. We're all in the same situation, so everyone knows everything about everybody else. And then someone makes it big, goes to the top, and kills himself with booze and whatever other shit he's doing, and those little secrets about him get out. Another laugh. Sometimes it pays to stay a nobody in Alabama. Then, getting into the Pontiac. But I'll say this, Hank was good folks. He sang what the folks round here were thinking, what they would sing about if they could sing a lick. And no matter what anybody would say about him or his daddy and mama, nobody's going to ever think bad about him. When you talk about a legend, that's what you're talking about. Go to church or the devil will get you. Billboard sign on I-65 north of Prattville, near mile marker 191. Interstate 65 snakes 360 miles from Gary, Indiana, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, ending in Mobile, Alabama. It runs down through Birmingham and Montgomery before veering southwest. Although it didn't exist when Hank Williams was alive and was called Route 31 until 1959, following it can take one on a tour of Hank Williams's life. Indeed, in 1997, the Department of Tourism designated the several hundred-mile stretch of it the Hank Williams Trail, though people also call it the Lonesome Highway and the Lost Highway, the latter being engraved on bright green signs at spots along the road. Some will even tell you the highway is haunted, not just by Hank, but because it was paved over Creek Indian burial grounds. Then, too, they say Hank was part Creek. Only one of his boyhood homes still stands in Georgiana, its white wood frame and wraparound porch now the exterior for a Hank Williams museum, which contains items like his old bed, records, straight razor, first guitar, the Victrola he listened to when country music was in its infancy, and the church bench he sat on with his mother and sang hymns to the glory of God, which couldn't keep the devil from getting him. An old boxcar painted red, white, and blue sits on nearby abandoned tracks, adorned with a red, white, and blue sign that says, Hank Williams Boyhood Home and Museum. Drink Coca-Cola. Every summer for the last 37 years, they've played honky-tonk blues here at a festival in his memory. In Montgomery, where Hank Williams went on this road to become Hank Williams, his grave, beneath a 20-by-20 family plot out at Oakwood Cemetery Annex, dwarfs most of the other stones, including those of 3 Confederate generals and 4 Alabama governors. Unlike in Nashville, where Hank molded country music as we know it, Hank seems to be in the loam and woodwork of Montgomery. You don't have to find Hank's past. It finds you, in the life-size bronze and pewter statue of him decked out in his cowboy hat and natty suit, strumming his guitar at Dexter and Perry, where he first lived here, a block north of the city. There is the boarding house, once run by Lily Williams on Catoma Street, and the stately brick building now a home for the elderly, but once the Jefferson Davis Hotel, where Hank sang on the radio. The baby blue Caddy, long as a city block, its gigantic chrome grille kept shiny, is in the Hank Williams Museum on Commerce Street. The car's back seat is still indented by the backside of the man who didn't see that New Year's Day in '53, the walls around it displaying items of his wardrobe, such as a brown leather fringed three-quarter-length sport jacket and brown cowboy boots with green, red, and white trimming. Montgomery is a cosmopolitan city anchored by a good old boy ethos and some ugly history of its own. It was here, of course, that Rosa Parks refused to sit in the back of the bus in 1955. In 1957, Martin Luther King was roughed up by cops during a sit-in at a lunch counter during the Montgomery bus boycott, sparked by Parks's arrest. The city, nonetheless, is sometimes called the birthplace of the civil rights movement, a birth that somehow occurred as George Wallace sat in the State House here, dragged out of the Dark Ages by marches such as the one after the 1965 Bloody Sunday Massacre in Selma, capped off by King's "How long, not long" speech. Yet for years after, it was where ancient laws banning interracial marriage stood until 2000, where the Stars and Bars flew until 2015. But things like that never mattered much, or so it seemed, when Hank was around. Go south on the lonesome highway and you'll see why. Here, largely forgotten by time, country churches are preserved for once having been the Williams family's Sunday morning sanctuary, where he prayed and sang gospel songs, while his mother played the organ like a good church lady. There are barber shops where he might have once gotten a haircut and shot the breeze, gas stations where he might have pulled the Cadillac in for a fill-up, chicken shacks where he ordered a bucket of wings, heavy barbecue sauce. Here you know why Hank Williams could never have come from, say, Texas, could never have pulled off feigning humility where none exists. Many songwriters have been inspired by what they saw in Alabama, good and bad. Long past the time when people sang about coming from Alabama with a banjo on their knee, a black blues song like Alabama Bound, covered by Leadbelly in 1940, reflected temptations of the flesh Hank could relate to. Why don't you be like me? Why don't you be like me? Drink yo' high-tension whiskey, babe, and let yo' cocaine be. Decades later, modern songwriters were more focused on deconstruction, the most indelible, Neil Young's Alabama. Alabama, you got the weight on your shoulders that's breaking your back. Your Cadillac has got a wheel in the ditch and a wheel on the track. Young didn't stop there. In Southern Man, there were imprecations that your crosses are burning fast. That sparked Lynyrd Skynyrd's Sweet Home Alabama, defending Southern men from Northern meddling. Yet Hank Williams himself wrote exactly one song about his home turf, Alabama Waltz, which he rendered as a mournful ballad, not a hootenanny. But Williams still carried Alabama with him, and was an amalgam of everything written or sung about it. All the despair and hopelessness, all the evil and the good about it, informed his sensibilities. It winks at a listener, or spits in his eye. Although almost no one is left who knew him or heard his music in real time, Alabama still claims him, still owns him. Proudly, the folks along the Hank Williams Trail inform a visitor from the North that it was they who gave Hank to the world personally. And then they make very clear to the Northern visitor, don't you ever forget it, son. Part 1, 1923 to 1937. 1. King Hiram. Hank Williams's granddaddy was in the Union Army during the Civil War. You heard that right. To be fair, there is a catch and a long story to it, proving how resourceful Williams' men could be, at least sometimes, in keeping themselves alive. Irvin Polk Williams, a South Alabama farmer, who, like the rest of the Williams clan, could only imagine owning a plantation and slaves, joined the Confederate 18th Infantry, Company F, in 1861, and fought in the Battle of Shiloh. Not long after, however, he was captured by the Union Army during the Battle of Richmond. Because he knew a great deal about Confederate troop movements around Mobile Bay, Alabama, he was not your common prisoner, and thus was offered a deal. He could avoid imprisonment.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?